Murder, patron saint of the Orokin school of political assassination, known as the Scoria. Each assassin bore a mark, a swirling, smoky black jewel between their eyes. You are forever the Scoria. The Scoria is forever you. No devotee knew of any life, any thought that was not Scoria doctrine. For every question, so the Orokin of the Scoria said, Ash was the answer. Two notable students of the Scoria's anthracite halls were also two brothers, Dom and Pilio. Dom was nimble, cunning, and a quick study with the blade. His brother, Pilio, however, was not so gifted. While he idolized Ash, worshipped him, Pilio lacked Dom's grace and clarity, and Ash's ruthlessness. However, it was Dom who'd been captured by the very target he was tasked to kill. A sin unforgivable to the Scoria, so it fell to Pilio, the Lesser, to uphold the Scoria by taking Dom's life. By this, the Seven would have assurance that Dom's flaw was not a familial trait. You see, as you might expect of an Orokin school of murder, the Scoria were ruthless when it came to academic excellence. With Dom dead at Pilio's feet, two essential killings would have taken place. That of a failure, and that of any shred of pity within Pilio. Ash would oversee Pilio's mission. Pilio's soul was to die that day, as the life drained from his brother's eyes, or, if he could not do so, beneath the blades of his lifelong idol, Ash. A sliver of pale sun found them close to a stately tower in the dusty heart of Martialis metropolis. Coils of red Martian dust trailed tongues from the dark metal of Ash's Edo epaulets. The boy idolized the Warframe and was eager to prove himself, even as some part of him felt cold and afraid at what he must do. Doubt is betrayal, taught the Scoria. Pilio recited this, but could not quench the fear he felt. Fear of what he must do, and fear of what his hero and idol would do to him should his faith fail. Ash gave the signal. Pilio shot forward in a bold, unconventional dying vine pattern, readying the Scoria-favored dust fang technique. The tower guards squinted into the amber light of the Martian sunrise as a flash cloud of smoke flooded the lane before them. Shaking sleep from their heads and still thinking of breakfast, the guards readied themselves. From the smoke flew stars. Staring into the lifeless eyes of the guardsman at his feet, bile rose in Pilio's throat. The boy berated himself this weakness, this disgust. Touching the symbol of his order, the smoke gem between his eyes, he muttered a prayer for strength. Stepping over the carpet of bodies, Ash crept into the courtyard, knowing full well the 50-strong house guard would show itself in force. With a sudden clatter, reinforcements lined the courtyard walls, balconies. The Scoria had a saying, "You are immortal. One mistake makes that otherwise." Ash had never made a mistake. Here were 50. With one swift movement, the Warframe swatted the boy into cover, unslung his Corster bow, and sprang into a flawless grey chrysanthemum combat solution. Shame reddened Pilio's face as the courtyard lit noon bright with the glare of 100 muzzle flashes. His blade dry in his hand. Ash methodically met and disassembled each and every guard, mezzanine to mezzanine, a masterclass in the correct choices of stance, kata, technique and attitude. Bodies rained into the courtyard. Wincing, the boy looked away. Within minutes, 50 corpses lay at their feet. When Pilio felt Ash's shadow fall across him, he forced himself to look, trembling. Ash's inscrutable gaze pinned him. Chest tight, breath terrified and quick, Pilio forced himself to stand and face his assessor. He could not look at the bodies. Truthfully, he expected to die where he stood. If the Warframe approved or disapproved, he gave no sign. Rather, Ash opened an arm, showing the way toward Pilio's final trial. In the target's chambers sat a middle-aged man with long, handsome mustaches, his eyes sad and kind, and with him, Dom, in civilian clothes, sharing a glass of aged claret. Pain cracked through Pilio's brain, the smoke gem between his eyes flashing hot. Sudden images of sunlight, vineyards, a woman's face. The gem burned as it pushed these images away. A young man with grand mustaches smiling and saying, "Of all the sons I could have had, I'm glad it was you two." Pain. Dom leapt to his feet, urging his brother to hear what the target had to say. But Pilio saw only the scabbed-over divot between Dom's eyes, where a black jewel had once rested. Dom had turned his back on their order. Why? Why had he done this? The mustachioed man leapt to Dom's defense, snatching his sidearm from beneath his ironwood desk. A foolish mistake. Ash split into impossible multiples. The man opened fire on the three, before being seized from behind by the fourth. Ash's illusory clones vanished. The weapon clattered to the polished wooden floor, even as his feet left it, dangling 3 feet above, helpless. Those sad, kind eyes locked on Pilio's in a regretful farewell. "Ask the Warframe," Dom said. "He knows exactly why." Fear filled Pilio's heart. Pilio turned to his idol, that saint of murder. The same question, but this time for Ash. Why? That moment of breathtaking impudence stretched for an eternity. Ash released his grip. His prisoner flopped to the floor, gasping. With one great hand, Ash reached toward Pilio's face and sank a vicious talon beneath that midnight jewel. Pilio screamed. Blood flowed. The gem flew free with a nauseating pop, cracking against the wall to die in a weak plume of rancid smoke. Blinding white insight descended upon Pilio Danas. Pilio was Pilio Danas. Everything the black gem had walled off within his mind was now laid bare. The Scoria had stolen the sons of Leo Danas. Leo Danas, kind-eyed Leo Danas, was stealing them back. Of all the sons I could have had, I'm glad it was you two. Father and son beheld each other truly for the first time in almost 20 years. Pilio had long aspired to wearing the Edo armor, the highest honor, to signify his faith. But now he saw only the bare ribs of Ash's Cremata Syandana, signifier of death, and knew with certainty that was the sole credo of the faith he had followed. The boy, who until that moment had thought himself a lifelong killer, was now torn between the nocturnal life he thought he knew and the sunlit life he'd been stolen from. Torn between doctrine and family. And, blade in hand, torn between saving himself by killing his brother or dying alongside him at the hand of his idol. Ash waited, patient as the death he signified, in a room, in a moment that felt suspended in eternity, waiting for Pilio's decision. The blade fell from Pilio's hand. Dom reached out and gently took that hand. Ash did not move. Leo Danas swept his boys up and out of that room, and, as a family, they fled the tower, the city, and Mars forever. Ash did not move. So, what are we to make of this? Why did Ash, focal figure of the Scoria, go against doctrine and permit two boys who were both failures and traitors to fly free? What was it this killer saw in two near orphans that, shall we say, softened his heart? We do not know. Neither did Pilio, whose memoirs bring us this story. But we do know this. In the final days of Orokin rule, as towers fell and death came for the white and gold gods, the Scoria were not spared. No, rather their senior ranks, the mentors and chief assassins, were exterminated to a figure in a pogrom of ruthless and breathtaking efficiency. A near total destruction led, in the main, by Ash. Curious? No, this is Atlas, hard as stone. Is it any surprise that his story begins with an asteroid? Temple Telemon had cast a spell on the indentured masses with a song that heralded the coming of a great stone destroyer, a god who would shatter the world and lead them to a great rebirth. The Orokin mocked the cult's off-key singing, their spasmodic dancing, but the spell only grew stronger. Telemon broadcasts would oft-times wedge into control channels to spread their doomsday message. For the suffocated lower castes, the notion of something more powerful than their Orokin masters must have been intoxicating. A brutal Orokin crackdown seemed to be working, until an asteroid was detected on a collision course with Earth. The Telemons celebrated it as prophecy writ true, divine intervention. For the first time in living memory, the Orokin showed vulnerability. It did not matter that the destruction would be total. For the Temple, this was a sign of a new age. A probe was sent to the asteroid, perhaps seeking proof of divine intervention. It found intervention, though it was anything but divine. The rock had been fitted with colossal steering thrusters, and manning those thrusters, a bevy of well-armed Telemon. Having taken fate into their own hands, they set about a final convulsive dance aboard that rock. Battle cruisers, Orgon missiles, a gale force of Dax. The Orokin could have resolved this in any number of ways, but their enemy was not the Telemons themselves. It was their ideas. Atlas alone was sent. As he crashed onto that rock, his Shakiro helm greeted the cultists. Note the angled ballistic plating and reinforced neck protection. He would soon need. For years, historians felt this tale of Telemon quite improbable, an artifact of Orokin propaganda myth. Then, on our system's outer edge, we found a debris field of small rocks and dust in a lazy elliptical orbit. Upon these rocks, we find the remains of peculiar stone statuary. The petrified figures, clearly temple members, have been frozen into a tableau of struggle and death. Or was it perhaps a dance? This remarkable find forces us to rethink the entire tale as fact. Stratum Cyandana, reserved and austere, until you turn it over and reveal the glowing hue of the amethyst crystal within. A breathtaking geode. Imagine its spiraling ribbons as Atlas tore toward the killer asteroid's thrusters. His plan must have been to reorient them and push the rock away from Earth. But, as the story goes, as he neared, the cultists detonated the thruster's footings and sent them careening into space. They were no longer needed. Mass and inertia would carry the rock to its fate. Atlas was out of options. Or so the Telemans thought. The Techo are perhaps my favorite pieces in this gallery. Note the intricate, ornate moldings, the complex blades. Quite the contrast from Atlas's otherwise workmanlike appearance. The beauty and craftsmanship conceal the true purpose of the Techo, as indentations found in cultist skulls attest. I have to wonder what frenzied dance would have been interrupted, or if the whiplash strikes and jabs of the Techo might have blended into the crowd's fitful celebration. Before you, a rare sight, 2 rumblers, painstakingly recreated from fragments of the aforementioned tableau. How these inert and rigid formations are compelled to life by Atlas defies reason. Yet it is true. Consider the confusion of those Telemans as the very stone they worshipped came to life and set upon them. How could they retaliate against such a thing? Like sparring with a landslide. Earth swelled on the horizon as the cult mocked Atlas with their chorus, "The stone shall shatter all." Across the system, every Teleman echoed that final hymn. Children as far as Neptune turned their heads from greasy broth and gazed toward Earth. Would that careening stone change everything? Atlas kneeled down, head and hands pressed to the ground in apparent defeat as the Telemon's hymn grew even louder. But Atlas was listening, feeling, the way the stone trembled to the hymn's pitch. The faults within the asteroid became vivid to him, and so a new song rose up. Rumblers, erupting in a godlike rhythm, beating along the faults until Atlas, alone, struck the final resonant chord. A tremor forked through the rock until, all at once, the great asteroid exploded, its dust falling as scintillating rain, sparking across the atmosphere, and then gone. The Telemon's song fell silent, and children as far as Neptune turned away and swirled their spoons in greasy broth. Ah, Guass. Where to begin? Where to begin? Well, the Ceres excavation, of course. The site of the ancient Tower of Ultra. Blastcrete emplacements, air sentries. Its fields saturated with tremor mines. A great fortress for the great lords of Ceres. Until they were pitched from the roof. Immortal bodies erupting on the dread mines below. An insurgency from within. The Dax, sent to reclaim Ultra, fared no better. Those that ran the gauntlet of bore guns were soon cindered in the field beyond. And that's when they called in our fleet-footed friend here. Dual sidearms pulled from Ultra's outer ring of Blastcrete bunkers. Something crashed through those bunkers at great speed. The impact scattering stone and flesh all the same. An unearthly kinetic shockwave. Those insurgents with the misfortune of surviving the initial blast must have seen the Icarius for themselves. The Axeltra, a rapid-fire micro-missile launcher. The smooth polycarbonate barrels still carry a vague stench of ozone. Some think Guass was a blunt instrument, all speed, with as much versatility as a cannonball. But the Axeltra implies more. It implies surging in, inviting the enemy to consider the blade, then rebounding to let missiles answer their confusion. Not the standard dress helm. This one has specialized control surfaces, angled plating, supreme streamlining. It catches the light in a curious way, doesn't it? When it shines just so, I see myself atop Ultra, a hostage perhaps, peering out across the desolate field, and then I'd see it, a pale glint of light. Dax of the day had a saying, that which cannot be hit cannot be killed. I can only imagine what they thought when they saw Guass that day. A gleaming bullet, this Syandana pinned rigid like a flag in a maelstrom, streaking toward Ultra, a stripped-out Gauss airfoil system. These fanciful contrivances contribute the Kubradon's share of this Warframe's acceleration. Strength, mass, density, all held in a delicate balance. Gauss, front edge, smooth, heat-resistant composites, trailing edges, streamlined, foiled. This particular one vaguely warped by extreme heat stress. The Saint of Ultra. If the mind wanders, what do you see? I see a vivid, lord-like festival. The tremor mines bursting in a blinding wave, rising toward Ultra. And Guass, a smear of light, just ahead of the thermal avalanche, fast as fire. No, faster. Grendel, primal, insatiable, and, as this exhibit will demonstrate, a creature of surprising compassion. After the fall of the Orokin Empire, a surviving Orokin executor, a violet-scented brute named Karish, lorded over Europa's frozen, famine-struck city of Ridda. Safe within his walled manse, the moist and loathsome Karish lived a lavish life, while his frail citizens obeyed every edict in the hope of receiving his pre-masticated table scraps. As the city starved beneath him, Karish commanded yet another feast for himself and his gluttonous sycophants. 12 courses for each of his 12 grafted digestive sacs, and one uninvited guest. There remains a shallow trench through the ruins, as if some colossal boulder had crashed from the manse and rolled down the hill. But what if it had rolled up? Imagine, if you will, Karish's Dax on the day, peering out, dumbstruck by what they saw. They readied no blade, sounded no alarm, as the expanding orb of gristle hurled toward them. And then, in a spasm of giblets, Grendel was before them, his cutlery in hand. The masseter, scraps of cloth matching Grendel's unexpectedly elegant Sayandana, were retrieved from the site, hooked on the remnants of gilded gates, stained with evidence of his degustation. Indeed, most of the Orokin hangers-on who attended the feast became it. And Karish himself fled shrieking into the hills of Ridda as fast as his 12 exosac levitators would carry him. It came as no surprise to me to find this tiny fragment of Gauss just outside the city. Indeed, if one thing is for certain, wherever we find evidence of Grendel, we're sure to find some trace of Gauss as well. Did they breach the city as a pair? Or did Gauss hang back to intercept returning patrols, generously letting his friend Grendel eat his fill at the feast within? Note the open face, almost more like design, a fitting visage for one of such singular, rapacious predilections. Grendel may hunger, yes, but not with the excesses of gluttony, not when others are in need. Oral history tells of Grendel, newly engorged from his repast, rolling through the miserable slums of Ridda, reinvigorating the sick and the lame, the hungry and the dying, with the power he had stolen, consumed, from their oppressors. Here we have shattered fragments of the manse wall, and the gate, mangled by Grendel's masseter blade. One can almost see the city's masses, newly rejuvenated by Grendel's healthful blessing, storming the manse. Shattered gates thrown wide, they take back what was theirs, namely, control of their future. See here the scattering of genuine Orokin dinnerware. Worn with time, these must have been used for countless meals, as the people of Ridda bravely weathered the dark times ahead. Many warframes have speed and litheness, but power, momentum, impact, these require mass. And there, the creased midsection, the seam, does it split? yawning open with a jagged, vacuous aperture to who knows. A certain Orokin may have found out. That night, the people of Ridda ate their fill, feasting until the frozen mountains lit warmly with the dawn. It was toward those roseate peaks that the Executor had fled, pursued by Grendel. What his fate was, I cannot say. But as the people feasted, so the story goes, they were suddenly struck silent by a strange, deep sound. A rumble carried from mountain to mountain. A single, satisfied belch. Ivara, the Huntress. This tale comes to us from the secret history of the Orokin court by the historian Porvis. Have you perhaps heard tell of the Myrmidon? No matter. A preternatural beast figure straight out of myth he was. One whose prey had no equal. Warframes were what this villain hunted. It is said a number of frames had been erased from history by this monster. Models who no longer exist on any record. Those who are not remembered. It hardly seemed possible that a single person could stand against a Warframe, let alone destroy it, let alone several. Perhaps Porvis enjoyed the telling a little too much, or perhaps there is something to it. Ivara encountered the Myrmidon quite early in her history. Quite early indeed. A Dax emergency call, so Porvis writes, led Ivara and two unknown Warframes to a convoluted cave system. They found it littered with the bodies of murdered Dax and resplendent with bioluminescent fungi. I imagine the chitinous folds of her Salix Cyandana would have made for excellent camouflage within that malevolent, supernal glow. The secret history tells us that the Myrmidon appeared boldly before the three in a wide chamber connected by many tunnels. Clad in red and gold armor, it gestured to the first Warframe with what Porvis describes as a strange, clutching motion, as if seizing a falling apple. But it was no greeting, as we shall see. The powers of that first Warframe, the recipient of that gesture, promptly failed. The Myrmidon took advantage of the confusion to leap upon the hapless frame and press a palm to the warrior's head. In lurid detail, Porvis describes a flash of the most scintillating emerald light, and Ivara's battle sibling collapsed to hot dust. Porvis tells us he compiled much of this tale from overheard exchanges between members of the Seven and details that remain consistent in courtly whispers. He tells us the second frame suffered the same fate as the first. Reacting, Ivara whirled and promptly vanished. But one clutching gesture in her direction and Ivara's powers fled, her cloaking field nullified. Visible, vulnerable, she loosed a dash wire arrow to a high alcove, but it never came. No escape. The Myrmidon was upon her. The Huntress spun, opening fire with Axamati pistols to send that devil scrambling for cover, arm thrown protectively across that twisted, armored head. That clutching gesture was the key. Ivara needed a plan, and she needed it fast. Ivara ran at a wall, and up it, hanging there, waiting, as the Myrmidon flipped into the room, blasting the spot where he'd expected her to be. Frustrated, he again made that same elaborate gesture, trying his luck, and she saw it. That bracelet upon the wrist that glowed softly with the movement of that clutching gesture. Ivara flipped from her perch, shouldering her exquisitely crafted Rubico as she did so, and sighted the enemy. Through the Orokin's sculpted scope, Hunter and Huntress met eye to eye, each loosing a desperate blast, a bullet from Ivara, a killing light from the Myrmidon. The green light lashed, touching a shoulder plate of Ivara's Avia armor, reducing it to dust. It saved her. Huntress won out, her shot claiming the Myrmidon's device in a shower of sparks. But the Myrmidon's weapon remained lethal, and with it, he lashed out at Ivara in an emerald fury. Ivara hit the ground and sprang into a surrounding tunnel, the Myrmidon's shot lancing a gouge in the porous chamber wall. Ivara pressed her back to a shadowed outcrop at tunnel's end, while the Myrmidon's weapon blazed and cut and chewed through her only cover. As good a time as any to discuss the weapon before you. The Artemis bow, the Huntress's signature weapon, and the tool with which she has wrought so much good. Said by some to be spirit bonded to her, others say the product of forgotten Orokin technology. What Porvis tells us next displays to good effect what warrior and weapon were capable of. Pinned behind eroding cover, seconds from death, Ivara summoned her Artemis bow, and it came to her. She and weapon as one. Without rising, she pulled back, aimed high, she and arrow as one, and loosed. Under Ivara's guidance, the arrow turned its path and shot down the corridor toward the Myrmidon, and lengthwise through his weapon. Around Ivara, the walls flashed green for a microsecond as the Myrmidon's weapon erupted. And then, silence. What is a bow without arrows? And these arrows? The Origin system has never seen their like, able to change their very nature at the whim of Ivara. Sleep, cloaking, rapid fire, they are the embodiment of her legendary versatility. Ivara drew her bow again, this time for her fallen comrades. With inhuman speed, shot after shot snapped and plucked each segment of carapace from the Myrmidon's lean frame. Straps severing, clips popping, he was undressed with swift efficiency by the preternatural accuracy of her aim and rapidity. Even before her final arrow belted the visored helmet from his head, she had the killing shot knocked and ready. There he stood, the Myrmidon, slayer of warframes. Naked, beauty, symmetry, even the capacity for language, sacrificed for raw power. But his face was a mockery of an Orokin face. Those she was sworn to never kill. The smirk on his pallid, angular visage told her he knew it as well. The grand doors of the Chamber of the Seven flew open. Across that reverberating expanse of polished darkness strode Ivara, dragging her prize. Before the assembled council, she dropped him, and with it, the Myrmidon's battered helmet. Here he would meet justice at the hands of his own people. Here, her fallen friends would be avenged. She beheld the Seven, awaiting their judgment. The Myrmidon got to his feet, cleaning dust from one shoulder with a contemptuous flick. One of the Seven leaned forward, removing a curious thing from their slender head, a lattice of delicate silver, placing it on the elevated, chest-high curve of obsidian that separated her from them. Instantly, the Myrmidon collapsed, lifeless, to the floor. Ivara did not understand. Why? Why? A stately voice intoned her name. There stood Executor Ballas. He told her, "You have been battle and loyalty tested. Your companions, they were found wanting. They failed to adapt, failed to overcome, and so they are no more. But you, Ivara, you shall live. You shall be remembered." Her battle comrades, as we know, were not. Lavos, the transmuter, called by some, anachronistically, the alchemist. Transmutation, you say? A superstitious process from long ago in which deranged old men heated stinking substances over fires of dung, thinking they could make gold? No. To the Orokin, it was a darkly potent, forbidden science. They were not squeamish, nor moral. So what profound taboos must this art have violated? No transmuter was more dreaded than Yavi, the crawling serpent, the abhorred, the filth speaker. The Orokin feared him so greatly that they whispered he might somehow survive even the Jade Light, just as a severed snake was once believed to grow a new head. So instead, he was imprisoned that his evil might be contained, if not quenched. His jailer was a brute of a warframe named Lavos. The prison of Dabaoth Kra no longer stands. Both it and the slumped Venusian mountain peak upon which it stood were long ago obliterated. We have only records to tell us what went on there. Yavi was a scrawny, hairless man, scaly with skin disease. In reluctant recognition of his Archimedean status, he was permitted to wear the white robe, now a befouled, ragged garment. 2 tattooed serpents crawled up each bony arm from elbow to wrist. Lavos, we are told, was attentive to his prisoner. He administered the prescribed soup, water, and beatings with the same punctual fidelity. These are recreations of Lavos's own snakes. No mere tattoos, but living, bioferrous exoflesh. Observers at the prison reported that Yavi was frequently whispering to Lavos. There was some concern among the wardens, but they dismissed the whispers as mere posturing. Yavi's cell walls began to fill up with scrawlings, using blood and filth as ink. At first, these were simple symbols, but as time passed, they became more elaborate. It was as if the Archimedean was turning his cell into a demonic temple, baiting his captors. There was even an image of Lavos, resplendent in his cyandana of office, perhaps an attempt at a curse. Lavos was ordered to beat him harder, and duly did so. With the blood on the wall, Yavi drew a snake, an appeal, no doubt, to his depraved idol. Floor washer Bekran Zaft, the sole survivor of Dabaoth Kra, would later tell of how Lavos would stride from cell to cell, weighty shotgun in hand, clubbing and beating as required. The nightmares still haunted her. The warden's records reveal an increasing unease with Yavi's bizarre behavior. Regardless of the potential risk, they determined that he should be executed. After a fashion. They would use cellular reversal. Yavi would be reduced to a mere biological pulp with no more sentience than bread mold. But the executioner? No jailer wanted to be the pobber to bell that cavat. So Lavos received this ceremonial helm, along with the power to reconfigure organic matter. He could be their instrument. The walls, floor, and ceiling of the cell were, by now, overwritten with text. Lavos watched over Yavi continually. Bekran Zaft tells us that, curiously, Lavos no longer beat the prisoners in the other cells. Even when the inmates shoved one of their hated fellows into his path, expecting a bloody beatdown, Lavos merely waited for him to get back to his feet before moving on. What actually was this forbidden practice of transmutation that terrified the Orokin so? At its pinnacle, it was nothing less than the purposeful elevation of consciousness. To the Orokin, prisoners of their endless golden dream, the thought that a person could rise above their station was anathema. Transmutation could turn commoners into kings, or riches into garbage. Worst of all, it could teach people not to be afraid. I have seen a preserved image of Yavi's cell. His scrawlings were not demonic sigils and barbarous texts, but star charts, evolutionary trees, genome structures. Yavi was not defying Lavos with these cryptic daubings in his own blood. He was enlightening him. Not dark sorcery at all, but radiant science. And the snake? A symbol not of corruption, but of healing. Yavi was a teacher. He might have taught millions. Now he had only one student. But that student was attentive. Bekran Zaft says this of Execution Day. The jailers gathered in the auditorium with a slow, funereal tread. Lavos escorted Yavi to the execution dais. He gently raised a hood over Yavi's head, cobra-like. He turned, then, to face the Orokin Warden, shotgun trembling in his mighty hands. The silence, Zaft says, was absolute. But then, from beneath the hood, came a whisper. Yavi had some final words for his student. The Orokin jailer shifted uncomfortably, looked to his functionaries. Would the execution even take place? Lavos gave a stiff bow to Yavi and activated his power. Yavi's skin peeled off in one grisly sloughing. He liquefied into a biological soup. A cheer went up from the assembled jailers. Lavos gathered the remains of Yavi tenderly in his hands. A soft glow emanated from them, as, in one horrible moment, Yavi's Orokin oppressors realized what they beheld. And then, panic. Lavos was transmuting the remains. A twining, living snake seethed up Lavos's left arm. Yavi, transformed, and still, after a fashion, alive, just as they had feared. A second snake coiled around his right arm, this one sprouting from Lavos's own flesh. Then, Lavos leapt into the midst of the assembly, hurling vials left and right, bathing the hapless, screaming jailers and functionaries and their warden in icy vitriol. Not one survived. Not for long, anyway. And Bekran Zaft? Lavos bowed to her and moved on. They say that Lavos often takes counsel from his serpents. One is his brutal advisor, the other his wise teacher. Both have their wisdom, and Yavi still whispers to his beloved student. Much like the snake, Lavos is easy to misjudge. The serpents that poison can also cure. He may have been a monster in his previous life, but he was able to achieve something that eluded the most powerful of the Orokin. He changed. Moreover, he changed himself. Yavi may have helped and instructed, but the will to change must have begun with Lavos. Perhaps we all have that golden gleam coiled within us somewhere, ready to slither forth from its old skin. We must only beware that we do not condemn as devilish that which we do not yet understand. Nezha, the mercurial firemonger, the clarion of hope. However foul the decadent excesses of the Orokin Empire, the aftermath of its collapse was arguably worse. But the darkest times often give rise to the brightest legends. We've seen that happen often, haven't we? Tales of a being called Nezha predate the Orokin fall. They speak of a swift warrior who leaves trails of fire, summoning barbed spears from the very earth. But it is during a time of unsurpassed brutality, at a moment of wanton slaughter, that this most blazingly improbable of warframes first proves to be more than a myth. This blade, a tongue of exquisite flame in cold metal, it was unearthed by a poor farmer of Reshantur as he followed his hulking plough beasts across fields he would never own. Another might have bravely kept the dagger, but records suggest he handed it into his overseer on the spot. A half cup of rice, his princely reward. With no Dax to keep the peace, and no Parvus Granum to hold the corpus board together, bloody land grabs were routine. The fertile fields of Reshantur changed hands many times. With each hostile takeover, slain workers became fertilizer for the next yield of crops, tended by the survivors. And so it went. This created what you might call a staffing problem. If all the surviving adults are working the fields, then who is left to defend them? Children, that's who. This dismal little relic was once part of a Syandana, shall we say. Though not of Orokin make, clearly. No, its young owner wove this from a fertilizer sack. There were many such capes found at the site, enough for an army. Mowers were expensive, you see. Children, they were cheap and plentiful. It made good business sense to arm them. Not the very youngest, of course, just the near adults. The still unbroken, those who understood the stakes. The young defenders of Reshantur took their duty seriously. They formed into a little clan, trained every day in the ruins of an old temple, and even made themselves a uniform of sorts, part of which you see before you now. But this humble cape was modeled on something even older, the Syandana of Nezha himself, displayed here before you. This chakram was found in the ruins of the Reshantur temple, along with fragments of stories scrawled on slates in an immature hand, and oaths of dedication to a figure of legend. It seems the child soldiers of Reshantur took courage from the tales of Nezha, adopting him as patron and protector. Their scratchings evince a firm belief that Nezha would bless them with victory, should they fight without fear, and abandon them, should they ever fear. So, they swore they would defend the fields to the last drop of their blood. Clever manipulation. I wonder who put that idea into their heads. At any rate, they accepted it on faith. At least, until the massacre of Reshantur. This spear, modelled on Nezha's own, was found buried in scorched soil. Note the size. Records of the attack are nigh impossible to find. Not surprising. The massacre was almost certainly covered up to protect what the corpus regarded as sensitive business practices. Imagine the children, Tenno, wearing their pathetic Syandanas, bearing flimsy weapons, but with heads high, as warriors. Think of them rushing at their far superior foes without fear, and imagine what those foes did. To this day, the fields of Reshantur cannot be ploughed. The blades of ploughs are dented and destroyed by an earth that, still, remains thickly seeded with shot and shells and the cold brass teeth of war. But that is not why the event is called the Massacre of Reshantur. The children charged, the corpus took easy aim, not one child's heart fluttered. And then, flame! The corpus surveyor, Yena Zasperin, says she found a solitary child wearing this helmet in the midst of a charnel field of remains. But they were the remains of corpus troops, some dismembered, some impaled, all burned. Nezha did it, the boy said calmly. He flew down from the sky and tore the enemy asunder with wheels of flame. When a child fell, he would raise them up again. Nezha moved quick as a scimitar, and the earth burned where his feet touched. Now the others had gone with Nezha, part of his celestial army. The boy had stayed behind to tell the story. To Zasperin, the boy was merely traumatized. The massacre, probably a mutiny within the Corpus ranks. But Reshantur has been excavated, and every single one of the thousands of blackened bones that were gene-tagged had belonged to an adult. And at last we meet Nezha face to face in all his unquestionable reality. Did this Warframe model itself on the myths to take on the mantle of a mythic hero, or were the myths left in the Warframe's wake, a blazing trail to light the way? History will always be some manner of educated guesswork, and occasionally one of faith. Perhaps in some deeper stratum, we will find the lost children of Reshantur, sad little clusters of bones, not saved at all. But I have faith we will not. I leave you with this. Why do you suppose it was the child soldiers that Nezha chose to protect? Any war has its innocent casualties, but these seem to have called to him. What could a Warframe, a lethal specialist warrior, possibly have in common with a child? That riddle, I fear, must remain a riddle. Nova, mercurial, unpredictable, and a miraculous example of harnessed antimatter. It would be a bold fool indeed who tried to tame lightning. One such individual was Wholesome Yer, a freelance problem solver who commanded high fees for his low morals. A deficiency that netted him great success in endeavors where a conscience would have held others back. He is the only figure known to have secured a back-channel charter permitting him to selectively raid certain rails, so long as Orokin ships were avoided. The story of Nova and Yer survives via the captain and security logs of the Orokin vessel Mascus Theodolite. It survives because it was deemed to be of historical importance. Orokin investigators scrutinized every frame of security footage, each line of the captain's log, for assurance that the outcome of this encounter was indeed true. The passenger vessel Mascus Theodolite reported critical problems with her engines. Nova, mistress of antimatter, was deployed to relight the Theodolite's antimatter reactor before the vessel was drawn into the gravity well of a nearby planetoid. 10,800 passengers were at risk. Clipping this Hyandana to herself, she exited her lander. The interior of the ship was deathly quiet. But then, chaos. Behind her, the section of the ship securing her lander was detonated and blown free, stranding her for the time being. From deeper inside the ship, cries for help. Nova sped toward the shouts of trapped crewmen. 8 were locked in flow control behind a hardened glass wall. Opening a wormhole between herself and them, she phased the crewmen to safety as their compartment flooded with lethal gas. Booming from speakers in every hallway, Wholesome Yer declared himself. Wholesome Yer, the man who at one time had run the Pluto Resistance, who spent 3 years terrorizing the rails between Jupiter and Venus just to prove that he could, who took that notoriety and translated it into a career. Security, political assassination, courier runs, torture, graft, blackmail, and in one case, so it was said, genocide. There were graves already dug for him by the many who wanted him dead. Word was, Wholesome already had a tomb prepared for himself on some distant moon, with a table piled high with riches and a chair just waiting for him to be sat in for eternity. A man capable of anything, and a man who would rather die than lose. A man easily recognized by the signature item before you. It was, so they say, an item of great personal significance to the old rogue. Why, and what history it shared with him, is a matter of some speculation. Unaware she was being led into a trap built just for her, I don't imagine Nova took any special precautions. This Flux model helm, for example, was fairly standard. The appealing venting displayed her antimatter nature, an announcement of power as much as an evocation of beauty. Where were we? Oh, aye, yes. Nova and the rescued crew moved for the escape pods. Once they were clear, she would about face and find some way to free the remaining 10,792. Alas, thuds and clangs resounded as every life pod ejected into space. Empty. Yer clarified, boomingly, that escape was not an option. To punctuate this assertion, bulkheads slammed down in every corridor ship-wide. The only path Yer left open, worryingly, was the one that led directly to the Theodolite's antimatter reactor, the very thing Nova had come to save. What was the old pirate playing at? Yer answered Nova's unspoken question. He had jettisoned the antimatter core. Without that, it was impossible for the reactor to function, and the Theodolite would smash into the planetoid in a matter of minutes. Yer had been paid, by persons unknown, to neutralize Nova completely. Yer, a man who prided himself upon an ignorance of the impossible, had agreed and devised this trap. Nova was a being created to contain and harness antimatter. The antimatter drive no longer had a fuel core. His proposition was simple. Nova would enter the reactor chamber, crack her own containment, and kickstart a new reaction using her own body as fuel. She could save 10,800 lives, but only at the cost of her own. She had minutes to decide. With a flick of her wrist, Nova's haiku throwing stars took out every camera in eyeshot, killing Yer's surveillance of them. This done, she turned to the technicians she had just saved. She would need their help. Nova walked to her doom. As she entered the reactor's chamber, Yer smugly assured her she was doing the right thing. Within the reactor's observation room, the technicians nodded assent. This was going to be close. From the bridge, Yer sealed the reactor chamber's blast doors. Seconds later, on Nova's signal, the technicians overrode that command. The doors shot upwards, and Nova wormholed out of the chamber and back into the corridor. Leaving that portal open, she created another, straight up into the vent system. On the bridge, Yer had little time to react, but react he did, ordering all prisoners to be killed. In that moment, a portal flashed into existence, Nova launching herself amidst pirate, captain and crew, and showed them what she was made of. In a blinding flash, Yer and every mercenary on that bridge was deeply infused with Nova's antimatter, starting a chain reaction within them. Yer realized what was happening, but too late. With a few precise shots from her Syra-customized sniper rifle, Nova neutralized those mercenaries who were quicker off the mark, before grabbing Yer by his brightly irradiated hair. Hurling him back through her network of wormholes, Nova sent wholesome Yer pinging from portal to portal before tumbling out into the reactor chamber. The wormholes collapsed. Yer struggled to his feet as every molecule in his body approached critical. Behind the glass, the technicians gave him a final, grim salute before slamming the blast door closed. Wholesome Yer, pirate and legend, went Nova. The reactor caught the reaction. The technicians harnessed it, and the engines of the Masker's Theodolite roared to life. It was, indeed, the boldest of fools who attempted to leash lightning. And so, a notorious rogue, said to be unkillable, met his end in the attempt, as the historical record now demonstrates. Styanax, the hoplite, the spear carrier, the shield bearer, the hero. We all know the story of Styanax and Leviathan, how wily Arya outwitted the cult leader they called the Philanthropist and called her Warframe ally down into the very heart of his monstrous laboratories. And no wonder, because these events did not happen in some distant epoch, in the times of the Orokin Fall, the Great Unraveling, the Age of Despots, or the Smaragdine Concord. They happened surprisingly recently. We have so many monsters. Every child in Orokin times heard legends of the Belligaunt, the Slather, and the venomous Thrax. Those were only stories, but one was real. Its creator was dubbed the Philanthropist. A corpus renegade, he established a cult in a formerly desolate region, in a location which I have agreed to keep secret to deter would-be looters and amateur archaeologists. The site was never abandoned, you see, and one person's historical curiosity is another's beloved home. With science, this philanthropist ensured ever more bountiful harvests and secured himself both gratitude and worship. Legend says he would travel the system, seeking out parentless children to shelter and educate. But this apparent charity concealed a darker purpose. The shield of Styanax, emblematic of his vow to protect those in danger. Young Arya was certainly in danger, and well she knew it. Along with her older brother, Darrow, she was one of the philanthropist's chosen. When they came of age, they will be summoned for a ceremony called Ascension Day, at which they would be taken to dwell with the philanthropist in eternal paradise. Certainly, none of those taken were ever seen again. I do not know how Styanax became Arya's protector, but I am certain Arya knew that when the philanthropist came for her, her ally would be waiting in the shadows. This was the fate of the Chosen, to be merged together into a single monstrous mass, Leviathan. What possessed the philanthropist to create such a travesty? We can only speculate, but we know that he had been studying the infestation and that he believed Warframes to be weak and obsolete. Perhaps he craved domination over others. Perhaps he yearned to create new life. Life over which he alone was God. Regardless, he was too much of a coward to pilot the thing himself. That was to be Arya's role. But Arya called upon Styanax, who, if the ruins of the temple roof are any indication, made an explosive appearance. Faced with the certainty of defeat, the philanthropist clambered into Leviathan and took command of it. Sketches of the Sinmora helmet were discovered among Arya's possessions, implying Styanax had a different earlier appearance. Arya must therefore have been in contact with Styanax long before her Ascension Day. But how? There is a story that crops were found flattened in those fertile fields in the shape of a lotus flower, not easily visible from the ground, but detectable by an automated satellite. Styanax was there to defend Arya, and defend her he did. Colossal fist met unyielding shield again and again. With agility and endurance, the Warframe outpaced his towering foe. As the Warframe and the monstrosity did battle, Arya saw a familiar face among the multitude. Her brother, Darrow. His blank eyes showing no sign of recognition. As Styanax struck and struck again with the Aphentis, making little headway against the relentless Leviathan. A final, desperate scream from Arya achieved the impossible. It awoke Darrow. From out of those thousands of fused bodies, a single mind was suddenly saying, no. Latching his remaining arm around his tormentor's throat, with the very last of his life's strength, the doomed Darrow distracted the philanthropist long enough for Styanax to act. One last act of love and protection for his sister. But the Warframe hesitated. It seems he understood the importance of Darrow's rebellion. If one mind could turn upon its master, why not all of them? With but a gesture, he gave the captive minds their freedom. Suddenly awakened and aware of their hellish plight, the damned townspeople tore at the philanthropist's exposed face, the Leviathan's body coming apart as arms broke free from the mass, clawing for revenge. Together, they dragged the screaming philanthropist down, rending and tearing. In that moment, we can be assured the philanthropist knew the depth of his failure, his defeat. Without worshippers, a god is nothing. And Styanax delivered the final, merciful stroke. Imagine the horror the non-chosen felt in the aftermath. Fear, uncertainty, and above all, unquestioned habit had allowed a monster to flourish. Arya took over the cult and made it a community instead. They still thrive to this day, or so it is claimed. Styanax is the story's hero, but it was Arya's courage that summoned him. All revolutions begin when one voice dares to say, I will not. Somehow, across the dark reaches, Styanax saw that courage burning bright and swore it would not stand alone. I would visit Arya's temple myself, but I am indisposed at present, a long-standing condition. All donations are, of course, appreciated. Welcome. Try not to touch anything. Impressive, isn't she? The relentless hunting shadow of the Knight of Naga Drums. The last thing many an Orokin lord ever saw. Voruna, she-wolf incarnadine. The heart of the pack, hunter of godprey. We remember her as a primal horror. The pitiless devourer, stalking burning cities of white and gold, slavering for godflesh. This was not always so. Once, Voruna was the obedient guardian of the Circulus, the holiest of Yuvan temples, upon none other than veiled Lua. Like a loyal beast, Voruna would roam Lua with her 4 steel-maned wolves, the stealthy Dinar, invigorating Raksh, the stalwart Lycath, and the fierce Ulfron. But what they were sworn to guard was perverse, wrong. In a ceremony reeking of Kuva, the Orokin candidate would force their consciousness into the new chosen body, the Yuvan, consigning the mind of the hapless former owner to oblivion. They call this life-extending process continuity. Executor Tuvul was one of the ruling 7 and head of the Yuvan clerisy, high-ranking officiators who enacted the hideous ritual, all of whom were now all dead, torn apart, all save for Tuvul, now a man pursued. He abandons his family to that night of horrors, his friends to the flames, and whips his slaves to ferry his decrepit, dying body to his personal ship. Destination? Void-locked Lua. Purpose? To initiate one final ceremony. To trade one last body, one last life for his own. before the Empire burned. To slip the noose and escape the relentless hunting shadow that had, one by one, in just one night, found and eviscerated every last one of his clerisy peers. The shadow that had once protected them. I never liked Tuval. What followed made me loathe him even more. Here is Dainar, the Shadowed. He gave Voruna the gift of stealth, that she might only take by surprise, but never be taken. Let us speak of what made the Circulus special. The first Void Conjunction. It came suddenly, steeping Lua in malevolent, lashing void stuff. Within the moonplasm, thoughts took horrifying physical forms. Images dredged up from childhood nightmares or adult neuroses were abruptly tangible and real. Madness overtook many. It was to this place, the Circulus, that Tuval fled, through a void tormented by an extremely unusual conjunction. Thrashing eddies, violent currents, and the appearance of horrifying beasts never seen before or since. It was as if, some have noted, the fabric of the universe echoed the upheaval, tearing apart the fabric of the origin system. Coincidence? I have lived too long to believe so, but can provide no explanation greater than that. Hoping against hope that the void would keep the shadow that stalked him from picking up his trail, Tuval touched down upon the powdery skin of sacred Lua. What Tuval lacked in loyalty, he made up for with rat cunning. He should have known better. It is unclear precisely why Lua is a site of very special void conjunctions, but enacting continuity within the Circulus and Uvarium thereupon guaranteed a safe and strong transition, so long as certain rituals were correctly observed. A privilege reserved only for the Seven themselves. Imagine the scene, as the innocent Yuvan would have witnessed it. The vivid insanity of it all. The appointed soprana, bridging the gap between worlds with her song. The Orokin executor, shrilling the ritual words. The bone-white void creeping in on all fronts. The Kuva, steaming scarlet in its glass bowl. And the imposing wolf giant, Voruna, pacing the perimeter, 4 loyal wolves at her side. This wolf you see here is Raksh, the Defender, Voruna's own loyal guardian, as she protected her Orokin overlord from whatever madnesses the Void Conjunction would bring, of which there were many. And on that night, Tuval had no such guardian. Quite the opposite. Now, Tuval would need flesh into which he could pass, but the shipments of fresh young bodies from across the system were no more. Tuval, we will see, had laid a dark contingency. Rat cunning, as I said. The third of Voruna's wolves, Lycath, the stalwart brother, the provider, and soul of the pack. We know that Voruna and her wolves had served rite after rite. She had watched the mists and savagely destroyed anything that menaced the ceremony, flanked by Lycath's fury. The Yuvan ceremony, continuity as they called it, was an obscenity. The Orokin elite, aged and foul, would slouch and leer as the Yuvan, young men and women, cultivated on Red Mars and worlds beyond for this dire purpose, were paraded before them. They would make their choice, conduct the ritual, and then, well, that young life would be gone. And when those eyes opened once more, it would be their murderer looking out from behind them. Is it any wonder Voruna freed from the leash of loyalty, was so intent upon making a meal of the Yuvan clerisy? I think not. Let's get to dessert, shall we? Behold, Ulfrun the Fierce, the most formidable of Voruna's sept. Executor Tuvul scrambled to set up the ritual room. This time, the ceremony was different. Instead of a soprana, there was a mere mandochord playing automated notes. And instead of the prepared Yuvan, there was a most unusual cryopod containing a young child sleeping peacefully. The aforementioned contingency. In Tuvul's hands, so it is said, were an artifact and a codex belonging to none other than Albrecht Entrati himself, father of void travel, and a man who had sacrificed his sanity to it. Tuvul opened the book to pages strange and profane. We know this, having retrieved it from the site much later. It is my belief that Tuvul intended to protect himself from the horrors the void would unleash, using what amounted to a madman's grimoire. A desperate act indeed. I like to imagine that as he parted his withered lips to begin the ceremony, to call down the void, that was the moment he heard Ulfrun's ravening howl. From void signatures, evidence at the site, and what recording technology survived that once-in-a-lifetime void conjunction, I infer the following. Forgive an old man some dramatic license. The kuva was poured, the lamps were lit, and the ritual of continuity began. As Tuvul intoned the barbarous versicles of continuity, a horde the breadth of which had never before been seen at such a ceremony massed in the gathering void. Things with 2 heads or none, lopsided, broken-horned, perhaps drawing their being from Tuvul himself, as if expressions of his vice. At this moment, I believe Voruna and her pack attacked, hoping to end the ceremony before it began. No such luck. The circle site was later found to be treacherous with the remnants of slain abominations. Voruna and her wolves tore into the manifestations, rending with axe and fang, while Tuvul droned on, panicked. The pack hacked and tore their way through the throng toward him. Why was Tuvul not the first to fall? I cannot answer. Perhaps Albrecht's work had something to it, or perhaps those beasts simply understood that this wretched old man was the only thing keeping the door open for them. Tremors shook the surface of Lua, and a great cry rang out, like that of a mother crying for her children. Tuvul sweated. The kuva trembled in its bowl. Voruna was relentless, demons falling to blade and fang. But it was not enough. The hordes of the void are without number, and this one, if hell has a hell, then those monsters knew it well. Gentle-eyed Raksh was the first to fall to scything blades. They killed Lycath next, then Dinar, and Ulfrun last of all. Voruna had howled many times before, in hunger, in anger, and in triumph. But now, for the first time, she howled in grief. Voruna trod and swung without relent toward the circle, carrying by their silver scruffs the severed heads of her fallen, beloved wolves, severed from their dead bodies by her own hand. With one last ululating cry, Tuvul's ritual reached its peak. Within the crypod, the child's eyelids fluttered, and Voruna staggered. In what scratchy stills survived in void-corrupted data masses, what I saw between child and Warframe was recognition. Tuval took some meager scrap of courage from this delay and reached for the bowl of Kuva, now boiling and steaming with weird energies. Voruna struck him aside and seized the energized Kuva, not for herself, but for her wolves. Holding it high, she doused herself and her slain packmates with it. Embraced by the seething crimson glow, connective tissue propagated. Sinew reached for bone, and within that marriage of occultism and science, she and her beloved wolves became one. Her brethren lived again in her. Voruna was now, and evermore, the heart of the pack. Cheated of his continuity, Tuval turned to flee. But his former warden was having none of it. Those who came after found nothing but gnawed bones, some of them unusually long, twisted within shreds of white gold raiments. Good. I did salvage one final image from those void-corrupted data masses, however. That of Voruna herself, striding back toward her craft. The child cradled in her arms. Curious.
There was once a Dax cavalry woman, the lover of an Orokin couple named Corfel and Aurelia. What was her name? We do not know, but they never used it. They called her by many pet names, though. For an exotic pet she was to them. Little Sweetness, Tender Petal, Wild Rider. Had a mere Dax been known to be engaging in relations with her betters, she would have been executed on the spot. But the couple's power and influence was such that the affair would never be publicly addressed. Still, they feared to use her name, for names have power. Many gifts they gave her, fine armor, rubido rings, and a horse of her own, on the condition that she never ever named it. Names were for people, not possessions, so long as it remained a mere nameless thing. She would never love it more than them. But the rider could not bear to deny her friend the simple kindness of a name. So she whispered into its ear, "You are Rakani, freshness after rain." And just as the couple had feared, she came to love the horse dearly. This was intolerable to them. The horse had to go. An accidental impalement was arranged. But fate played a cruel trick, and both rider and horse were impaled. Corfel and Aurelia hastened to her side. Ignoring the dying horse, they fretted over their lover as she coughed blood. Continuity was out of the question. In desperation, they turned to a certain expert and pleaded with him to let her live forever. He returned the rider to them, transformed to a warrior of living steel. Her sweet and pretty face looked upon them with a smile that would never fade. For all their talk of forever, they wearied of her immediately. Now that the relationship was no longer taboo, they abandoned it. Parties became awkward, when the rider stood vacantly by, useless as an abandoned doll. She had to go. They agreed. So, arrangements were made with a master of industry, and the rider, all unknowing, accompanied the couple to a facility. She lay down obediently when instructed, showed no emotion when the restraints clamped her limbs, and made not a sound when the full force of the dissolution beam blazed through her head and out of the back of her steel skull. The couple were satisfied. Their sentimental mistake was dead, and furthermore, the smiling doll's face was erased. Now they could erase it from their memory. I doubt I need to tell you what faceless thing clambered jerkily from the facility's waste disposal heap in the still of a Navarus night. How she sought for her Dax Nakana and found only the Overseer's whip-blade. Confused, vacant, she wandered. Why was she alone? Where was her loyal Rakali? She reached deep into despair and memory, and summoned up a ghost horse to run alongside her on the night winds. Now, at least, she was no longer alone. She groped for other memories, came up with hands overflowing with betrayal. When the morning sun rose on Corfell and Aurelia, they were faceless too, and quite still. After that, she wandered without purpose, and the legend of the Hollow Rider grew. And so we come to my part in her story. You must understand, dear, that it is terribly bad luck to be out on Navarus with no gift to give a reveler. And yet, that was my plight as I stood, my old bones aching, before the dreadful figure on the road many years ago. I have no face, the figure before me seemed to say, in a whispering voice that spoke in my mind. I have no name, only a need, and you come before me empty-handed this Navarus night. I do have one thing to give, if it please you, I said to her. My name. When you ride away, you shall be Dagath, and I shall be only grandmother. And that is the story of how I lost my name and kept my head. Though many others have since lost theirs. For with her name came a new purpose. Dagath, you see, means the mirror that accuses. They say that none can now look into the gulf where once her face was, without their own sins rising to accuse them, and a swift, sharp sentence following. A happy Navarus to you all.